Step out of the car." Now Marcus Webb's voice cut through the evening air before he even reached the driver's side window. He already had his hand on the door handle, already pulling it open before she could comply. Denise Calhoun kept both hands on the steering wheel, visible, palms forward. She did not reach for her purse. She did not turn toward the sound of his voice. She simply said, "Officer, I haven't broken any traffic laws. Can you tell me the reason for this stop?" He didn't answer. He yanked the door the rest of the way open and stood with his body blocking the street, badge catching the orange dusk light. "Out, I won't say it again." Denise stepped out slowly, both hands visible, every movement deliberate, and announced. She had parked her black Cadillac Escalade on the shoulder of Meridian Street, a clean stretch of road. No broken taillight, no expired registration, nothing. She had just left her mother's house 3 blocks east. She was heading to a dinner reservation across town. She counted. She had not been speeding. She had not run a red light. She had signaled every turn. She stood on the gravel shoulder. Her blazer was pressed. Her ID was in the inside pocket. She did not reach for it. Webb circled the vehicle. He looked at the interior through the passenger window. He pulled out gloves. "What are you looking for?" Denise asked. "Contraband." He said it like it was a punchline. A teenager on a bicycle slowed at the curb, pointed his phone at the scene, and said something to his friend that made them both laugh. A white man in a gray suit walking his retriever stopped briefly, watched, and nodded once in Webb's direction, the nod of a man confirming that something already expected was simply happening. A woman in nurse's scrubs crossed the street to the other sidewalk without looking back. No one helped. No one said a word. Webb reached into the back seat. His arm went in past the elbow. He worked for a moment, deliberately, his body blocking the view from the street, but not from the rearview mirror. When he straightened, he was holding a plastic bag. He had no idea. Because the woman standing on the shoulder of Meridian Street, hands raised, watching him in that rearview mirror, was Special Agent Denise Calhoun of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. She had been building a case on Marcus Webb for 14 months, and the bag he was now holding as evidence had been placed inside her vehicle, on film, by his own hands. She counted the charges as they came. Unlawful stop. Unlawful search. Evidence tampering. Obstruction of federal investigation. Civil rights violation under color of law. In 48 hours, every officer in that precinct would know his name in a way they never wanted to. Webb slapped the bag onto the hood of her car. "You're under arrest." Denise looked at the bag. She said nothing. She placed both wrists behind her back and waited. But this story doesn't start here. Rewind 9 months. Rewind 14 months. Rewind to a file that had been sitting in a locked drawer in the FBI's Chicago field office, a file that was building itself, one incident at a time, around a single name. Marcus Terrence Webb. Officer. 14 years on the force. 3 commendations. 2-time recipient of the district's Officer of the Year award. His face had been on a recruitment poster for the department. Badge gleaming, jaw set. The image of institutional authority and trust. Captain Harold Yates called him the most dependable officer in his district. Webb had 18 confirmed arrests for drug possession in the last 2 years, and Captain Yates had signed every commendation himself. 21 internal complaints in 9 years. 21. Excessive force. Unlawful search. Racial profiling. Filed by residents of the same 3-block corridor on the south side of the city. Dismissed. Every single one. The officer assigned to review them was Lieutenant Dale Simmons, who had ridden with Webb in a patrol car for 6 years before his promotion. The file in that FBI drawer had been opened by Special Agent in charge Raymond Okafor, head of the Public Corruption Division of the Chicago field office. He had been watching 2 names for 11 months, Marcus Webb and Harold Yates. He needed one more incident, one that was documented, incontrovertible, and clean enough to withstand any defense a veteran police union lawyer could construct. He needed someone inside. Denise Calhoun had been with the FBI for 23 years. She had spent the last 8 in public corruption, and before that she had spent 7 years in organized crime. She had testified before federal grand juries 11 times. She held a JD from Northwestern and a master's degree in criminal justice from Howard University. She wore her credentials quietly, not invisibly, but quietly. She had learned long ago that the rooms she needed to enter most were the ones that assumed she did not belong. She was 51 years old. She drove a black Cadillac Escalade that she had paid for in full. She lived in a house in Logan Square that she and her late husband had bought in 2003. She knew exactly what Marcus Webb looked like. She had been studying him for over a year. What she hadn't planned was that he would pull her over personally. She had been running a soft surveillance pass, driving through his patrol corridor at dusk, the way she had done twice before in unmarked vehicles with a second agent. But that evening, the second agent had called in sick, and Denise had made a judgment call. Nothing would happen. She would pass through, document his positioning, and head to dinner. She was wearing her recording equipment, a device no larger than a button on the collar of her blazer, active and transmitting to a receiver, in her bag. The bag was in the back seat. She had not violated a single law. Webb had clocked the Escalade at a red light 3 blocks back and followed. Now she was in handcuffs, and her equipment was running, and every word he had said, every word, was being received at a field office 12 miles away. Webb drove with one hand on the wheel. He was relaxed. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror twice in the first 6 blocks, and both times he looked like a man who had done this before and knew exactly how it ended. His radio crackled once. He turned the volume down without looking at it. "You know what you were doing," he said. Denise looked out the window. She said nothing. "Those your drugs or someone else's?" He almost smiled. "Because if they're someone else's, you might want to start talking. Could make tonight a lot simpler." Denise said, "I want my attorney." He laughed, short and dry. "You'll get your phone call." He didn't ask her anything else for the rest of the drive. He hummed something under his breath at a red light. He checked his phone at a stop sign. He did not appear concerned. At the precinct, she was walked through booking. She stated her name. She gave no other information except to repeat her request for legal counsel. The desk sergeant was a young officer named Carla Espinoza, who processed her paperwork with her eyes down. Her fingers moved over the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and had learned not to look too closely at what she was processing. At one point, she paused at Denise's address and looked up. She looked back down. Her jaw tightened. She did not say anything, but she did not look comfortable, and she did not look the way officers usually look when they think someone is guilty. Espinoza handed the paperwork to the officer at her right without making eye contact with Webb. Denise counted. 32 hours remained on her timeline. She had filed her contingency protocol with SAC Okafor that morning, a standing procedure for undercover proximity work. If she made contact with her primary subject, she had a 48-hour window before the monitoring team escalated to direct intervention. That window had started the moment Webb's hand touched her door handle. Webb had 32 hours. He didn't know it. He filed the arrest report at 8:17 p.m. He listed the bag as found in the rear left passenger area of the vehicle. He cited probable cause as visible paraphernalia through the vehicle's window. He misspelled paraphernalia. He listed her occupation as unknown. He logged out at 8:45, told the desk sergeant to have a good night, and stopped at a drive-thru on his way home. His social media showed a post at 9:12 p.m., a photo of his commendation plaques on his office wall, captioned, "Another clean day." 14 years, and still making this city safer. 42 comments. 31 were supportive. 29 hours left. 12 miles away, the monitoring station received its first alert flag at 9:49 p.m. The agent on duty that night was a man named Calvin Bryce, 26 months out of Quantico, still in the stage of his career where he took careful notes on everything. He had been watching the live feed from Denise's collar transmitter all evening. The signal low and steady, nothing unusual, and then everything at once. He had pulled the footage. He had watched it 3 times. Then he had picked up the phone and called Zach Okafor's personal cell. Okafor listened to 30 seconds of audio. He did not say anything for a moment after. Then he said, "Pull it all. Everything from the moment she turned on to Meridian. And get Sharma on the phone." Bryce was 26 months out of Quantico, and he understood, in the way young agents understand things before they become jaded, that he was sitting in a room where the conclusion of a 14-month case was playing out on a monitor the size of a tablet. He did not celebrate. He pulled the full transcript and began time-stamping it. At 10:02, Okafor reached Alsa Priya Sharma. He told her what they had. There was a pause on the line, the pause of someone reorganizing what they thought their evening was going to be. She said, "How clean is it?" He said, "Clean enough to frame." Then, "I'll call Judge Peralta." 22 hours left. In the holding cell, Denise Calhoun did not pace. Pacing is what people do when they are afraid, and she had passed through fear on this case 14 months ago, in the early weeks when the file was thin and the pattern was only a hypothesis and she could not yet see the shape of what she was building. She had been afraid then, in the specific way investigators get afraid, not of danger, but of being wrong, of watching something real and not being able to prove it. She was not afraid now. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about a woman named Yvette Monroe. Yvette Monroe was 37 years old. She had been arrested by Marcus Webb on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2019, stopped on her way back from picking up her daughter from school, pulled over for an alleged rolling stop at a corner where Webb's body camera had been conveniently off. A bag had appeared. The charges had been filed and then dropped 11 weeks later, quietly, with no hearing, no press statement, no acknowledgement from the department, no apology, no record in Webb's file. Yvette Monroe had lost her job at the hospital where she had worked for 9 years because the arrest appeared in a background check. She had lost her apartment 3 months after that. Her case was in the file. It was one of 21. Every case in that file was a person. Denise had read them all. She had read them at her kitchen table at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in February, cup of tea gone cold beside her, and she had sat with them for a long time before she closed the folder. She sat with them now, in the holding cell, with the fluorescent lights and the cold metal bench. 15 hours left. At 9:58 p.m., Zach Raymond Okafor received the transmission flag from the monitoring station. He reviewed the footage that included Webb pulling Denise over with no stated cause, Webb reaching into the vehicle while blocking the street-facing angle, and Webb placing a plastic bag on the hood. He called the U.S. Attorney's office at 10:02 p.m. He reached Assistant U.S. Attorney Priya Sharma, who was still at her desk. He said 4 words, "We have it all." Sharma began drafting the arrest warrant at 10:15. She called a federal judge at 10:43 p.m. The judge, who had been watching the case on the prosecution's radar for 6 months, reviewed the documentation in 40 minutes. By midnight, the warrant had been signed. At the precinct, Denise Calhoun sat in a holding cell, with her blazer folded neatly on the bench beside her. She had done this before, not as the arrested, but she understood the geometry of a holding cell at this hour. The lights were fluorescent and unforgiving. The bench was cold metal. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she counted. 22 hours left. She thought about Captain Yates signing 21 dismissals. She thought about the residents of those 3 blocks, the people who had filed those complaints and been told, each time, that the investigation found insufficient basis for discipline. She thought about a woman named Yvette Monroe, whose name was in the file, who had been arrested by Webb in 2019 for a bag that the charges were eventually dropped on, quietly, without acknowledgement, without apology. She thought about the expression on the desk sergeant's face when she had paused at Denise's address. Some people know when something is wrong. The question is always what they decide to do about it. Webb arrived at the precinct at 7:15 the next morning, 20 minutes early. He poured himself coffee. He talked with a colleague for 11 minutes about the upcoming weekend. At 7:43, he logged into his terminal to check the status of his arrest from the previous evening. He saw that a flag had been placed on the file. He assumed it was a paperwork issue. They happened. He went to find Sergeant Espinoza. Espinoza wasn't at her desk. She was in Captain Yates's office, door closed. Through the window, Webb could see Yates on the phone, standing, which he almost never did. Yates was the kind of man who conducted every conversation from behind his desk as a matter of deliberate authority. He was not behind his desk. Webb walked past the window. He got more coffee. At 7:52, the front entrance of the precinct opened, and 2 people walked in who did not belong. A man in a federal marshal's jacket and a woman in a dark suit carrying a document case. Behind them came 2 more. They spoke to the officer at the front desk for approximately 30 seconds. The front desk officer picked up the phone. 8 hours and 14 minutes remained. Webb was in the break room when his partner, Officer Dennis Ramos, appeared in the doorway with an expression that Webb had seen on other people's faces before, but never directed at him. "Marcus," Ramos's voice was careful. "You need to come with me." "What?" "Now please." They walked back toward the main floor. Captain Yates was coming out of his office. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has realized that a thing he thought was contained is not contained. "Yates," said Webb. And then the door to the holding area opened. Denise Calhoun walked out. She was not in cuffs. She walked ahead of a U.S. deputy marshal, unhurried, her blazer back on, her posture exactly as it had been the night before. She stopped in the center of the room. Webb stared. She looked at him. She said, "My name is Special Agent Denise Calhoun, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. The recording equipment I was wearing last evening transmitted everything that happened on Meridian Street to our monitoring station at 9:49 p.m. The bag you placed in my vehicle was handled with your bare right hand before you put the gloves on. We have that on film. Webb's face was very still. "I have a JD. I know what constructive possession is. I know what chain of custody means. I know that the lab results on your bag will come back negative because I have never possessed a controlled substance in my life." She smoothed the front of her blazer. "I suggest you call your union representative. You are going to need them." She walked out of the precinct. Webb stood in the center of the room. He looked at the marshal. He looked at Yates. He looked at Ramos, who had taken 2 steps backward. He sat down on the edge of the nearest desk. No one spoke for a long time. The federal arrest warrant for Marcus Terrence Webb was executed at 9:07 a.m. He was charged with civil rights violations under color of law, evidence tampering, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 3 counts of civil rights violations related to prior incidents identified during the course of the investigation. Asa Sharma filed simultaneously on Captain Harold Yates for conspiracy to obstruct and abuse of supervisory authority in the dismissal of documented complaints. Both men were walked out of the precinct building by federal marshals. It was a Thursday morning. Shift change had just occurred. There were 14 officers on the main floor when it happened. Not one of them said a word. Sergeant Carla Espinoza, who had not been able to bring herself to look at the address on Denise's intake form the night before, who had gone home and sat in her car for 40 minutes before going inside, who had called an attorney at 7 a.m. and asked a single question: did she have an obligation to report what she suspected? Walked into Zach Okafor's office at 10:15 a.m. and handed him a 2-page written statement. She had documented every night she had noticed Webb's arrest numbers. She had documented the names she recognized. She had kept her own notes, quietly, for 8 months, in a notebook she kept in her locker. She had not known what to do with them. Now she did. Denise Calhoun gave her formal testimony before a federal grand jury 6 weeks after her arrest on Meridian Street. Her statement lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. She began it the same way she had begun every testimony in 23 years, with the facts, in sequence, with no inflation and no omission. She said this near the end, in a section that the court transcriber later noted had produced a silence in the room that lasted several seconds after she finished. I did not identify myself immediately, because the man who had stopped me without cause, who was falsifying evidence against me while I stood with my hands visible, would have done the same thing to any black woman in that car. The stop was not about what I do for a living. It was about what I look like. If I need to announce a federal credential to be treated with constitutional dignity, then the credential is not the point. The stop is the point. The pattern is the point. We have 21 dismissed complaints that are now under federal review, and I would like this jury to understand that each one of those complaints represents a person who told the truth and was told it did not matter. It matters. Marcus Webb was convicted on all 4 counts. He was sentenced to 67 months in federal prison. He surrendered his badge and his pension. His commendations were removed from the precinct wall in March, 2 weeks after the trial concluded. Harold Yates accepted a plea agreement and received 36 months. He resigned his captaincy the day the charges were filed. Lieutenant Dale Simmons, who had reviewed and dismissed 21 complaints over 9 years, was placed under administrative review. He retired before the review concluded. His retirement was approved and processed with no notation in his file. The file on Yvette Monroe, the woman whose 2019 arrest had been quietly dropped, was reopened. The city attorney's office reached a settlement with her family in the spring of the following year. Zach Raymond Okafor, who had kept that file in a locked drawer for 11 months, was promoted to deputy director, Midwest Region. He gave a press statement when the convictions were announced. It was 6 sentences long. The last sentence was, "This investigation was made possible by an agent who kept doing her job." Sergeant Carla Espinoza's written statement was entered into evidence. She was not charged. She was transferred at her own request to the department's Community Accountability Unit, where she now runs training sessions on documentation and reporting procedures. She has trained 130 officers in the last 2 years. She keeps a copy of her original 8-month notebook in a drawer at her desk. One of the 14 officers who witnessed the arrest, a man named Officer Patrick Daly, who had nodded at Webb across the room and said nothing, enrolled in the department's Ethics Accountability Program the following month. He wrote an anonymous letter to the precinct's Community Advisory Board acknowledging that he had not acted when he should have. He did not sign the letter, but he sent it. Denise Calhoun returned to work the Monday after her testimony. She drove to the office in the same Escalade. She parked it in the same spot, in the federal building garage. She is still working. She does not talk about the case in interviews. She has not written an op-ed, given a keynote, or appeared on television. She has 2 pending investigations that she will not discuss. There is a new file in the locked drawer. She thinks sometimes about the 3 people on the shoulder of Meridian Street, the teenager who filmed and laughed, the man who nodded, the woman in scrubs who crossed to the other side. She thinks about what it takes to cross back. She thinks about Carla Espinoza sitting in her car for 40 minutes. She thinks about the step from knowing something is wrong to doing something about it, and how long that step can feel, and what it costs people to take it. She drives home in the evening. She sits on her porch. She pours a glass of iced tea and lets the neighborhood settle. She thinks, someone has to keep the files. Someone has to keep watching. If this story moved you, if it made you angry or thoughtful, or reminded you of something you've seen and never been able to name, share it. Share it with someone in your family. Share it with someone who thinks these things don't happen anymore. Stories like Denise's don't spread on their own. We spread them. Drop a comment below. Have you ever watched something wrong happen and felt the weight of what it costs to speak up? What does accountability look like in your community? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Not because of the numbers, because every story here is about someone who told the truth when the system told them it didn't matter. Every view is a record. Every share is documentation. Someone has to keep watching. That's us.